So what we've been seeing, and at National Defense University, we've been actually analyzing this multifaceted impact that the pandemic has had and divided it into four categories. First, on public health, in terms of actual impact on our populations. The twin crises of a health crisis and a severe economic crisis that threatens the economic prosperity, not just here in our homeland, but across the world, and the implications on public security, which are now required to address the pandemic on top of their regular law and order responsibilities. And lastly, on democracy, on the way we've been able to not freely move about. And we've seen massive social protests that have arisen from various countries' lockdown policies. So, as you know, we've been using the Johns Hopkins tracker, the dashboard, to monitor the propagation of the COVID-19 virus, which has now surpassed 100 million cases and over 2 million deaths. And here in the US, we monitor this every day, as you can imagine. It's a very useful tool if you're looking specifically country by country. And it is now commonly the accepted kind of reference when we're taking a look at how the virus is actually now also mutating, which is very disturbing with the variants that are seem to be much more contagious, but not necessarily more lethal. What we're also starting to see is that states risk the risk of alternative governance, a concept that my colleague Douglas Farah has written about extensively, where we actually have criminal gangs that are providing COVID-related services, such as assistance. They're the ones actually imposing the lockdowns and curfews. And here I chose a photo. These are care packages in Mexico that are being distributed by the Sinaloa cartel with a little bit of marketing and branding. You'll see the photo of El Chapo Guzman, who's incarcerated here in the US, but his image is still quite popular there. And inside these boxes are like hand sanitizer, gloves, and masks. It's like a COVID kit that they're distributing to win the hearts and minds of the local populations. What we've seen too is that the global illicit networks, that includes criminal groups, traffickers, terrorist groups, insurgents, have also been disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic. It's not that these activities have stopped. But it's very interesting to see how criminal organizations have quickly adapted to this new pandemic environment. We've actually seen how, since they've been so dependent on globalization, they had to adjust quickly when their global supply chains were cut in the initial months of the COVID lockdowns, and more importantly, the actual stoppages in terms of maritime and air travel that we were so accustomed to, that connected all of our countries and all of our markets. We've also seen an impact on money laundering and terrorist financing methods, especially in what I call the physical realm, whether that's through bulk cash smuggling, of having mules physically crossing the border with large sums of cash, or the dependence on international trade through trade-based money laundering that actually is so reliant on globalization and large flows of legitimate commerce to disguise the origins of their proceeds. And then physically, banks. What we've seen is much more activity in terms of mobile and then through the internet, and a huge explosion of the use of cryptocurrencies for the good and for the bad. But we're actually very interested in how criminal organizations are leveraging cyberspace to actually move their activities from the physical into the cyber realm. So what have we been observing is an adaptation by criminal organizations in this new COVID environment. Some of the crime is going from global to local. We're seeing this particularly in the case of Mexico. And as I kind of alluded to earlier, they're really getting into the business of medical supplies trafficking, whether that's PPE or contraband. There was a big scandal in New York about N95 masks that were actually not fit for the actual legitimate standards being peddled in the black markets. And now a lot of concern that the vaccines could be either diverted or more importantly, counterfeit vaccines could actually enter the market, and not just in Latin America, but around the world. We've seen more interest and more activity in counterfeit goods as people have smaller and less disposable income. And I've already mentioned that cyber is really a new area of operation with cybercrime and all types of kidnap for ransom and extortion and malware that's taking place in cyberspace. We've also seen higher levels and more importantly opportunities for corruption, and that presents a huge governance challenge, and the issue of high interest loans and loan sharking, as we term it. I made the mention already of the fear that in marginalized societies and marginalized communities, you can actually have alternative governance becoming the norm as gangs and cartels and mafias actually replace the actual elected governments in providing the basic services for a certain community. And what we're seeing, sadly, is there's more conflict and there's more violence. What we're worried about in the coming months is that once the COVID-19 restrictions are lifted and once the economy goes back to whatever the new normal is going to be here in the United States, we're anticipating a huge surge of drug trafficking and migrant caravans heading northbound, since we are the consumer market for both. So when we think about how we can better counter transnational criminal organizations in this new environment, we have to really focus on keeping the military and the police forces focused on transnational organized crime on top of their new missions related to the pandemic. These are the types of things that we need to prepare ourselves to anticipate, but more importantly, harness all of our resources at the national and then more importantly at the international level in order to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on the economy, security, and transnational organized crime in a way we can actually promote security and prosperity in the Western Hemisphere.